Good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of the Northern Neck National Heritage Area and the Northern Neck 250 Coalition, it's my pleasure to welcome to you today to, as Dustin said, the fifth and final event in our 2025 Signature Speaker Series. This speaker series focuses on Revolutionary Era history of the Northern Neck and is part of a 4-year commemoration of the birth of our nation. Our theme this year is We the People. We the people is a powerful and foundational phrase in our culture. It's symbolic of our ever-changing idea about belonging and the essence of our collective identity as Americans. Dr. Lisa Wilson is with us today to share her perspective on We the People by exploring the history of stepfamilies in early America. Before introducing our speaker, we ask that you take a moment to silence cell phones and also please hold any questions until the end of the presentation. We'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Now it's my pleasure to tell you more about today's speaker. Dr. Lisa Wilson is the Charles J. McCurdy Professor Emeritus of American History at Connecticut College. She received her undergraduate education at Franklin and Marshall College and her master's degree and PhD from Temple University. Dr. Wilson's book, Ye Heart of a Man, The Domestic Life of Men in Colonial New England, won the Homer D. Babbage Jr. Award from the Association for the Study of Connecticut History, the Phi Alpha Theta Book Award, and was selected as an outstanding book by the University Press Book for public and secondary school libraries. She's also the author of Life After Death, Widows in Pennsylvania, and A History of Stepfamilies in Early America. She's the recipient of several major fellowships in her career, including the Andrew W. Mellon Faculty Fellowship in the Humanities and the Charles Warren Center Fellowship, both at Harvard University, National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and American Antiquarian Society National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Dr. Wilson is the former chair of the History Department at Connecticut College and was awarded the 2019 Helen Brooks Reagan Faculty Leadership Award for Outstanding Leadership. Her historical research interests focus on North America and the Caribbean, and she's currently working on a book about experiences of 17th century women in Barbados. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Wilson.
Good afternoon. Want to talk stepfamilies? I want to start first with my experience with the Park Service. When I was in college, I think of it this way, that George Washington and the Park Service decided I should be a history professor. I had an opportunity through a state-run work-study program for scholarship students to work at Valley Forge State Park outside of Philadelphia. It was 1976, the bicentennial of the American Revolution. I became a guide that summer at the park. I had access to a dusty room full of books where I spent a week reading and trying to get ready to be a tour guide. I dressed in period costume and that summer telling people about the park. I discovered I loved history and changed my major in college accordingly. Fast forward a few summers in my new, somewhat elevated capacity as a history graduate student, I found myself looking for summer work, again at Valley Forge, for this time the state park had transitioned into a national park. Professional historians taught us, interpreters then, no longer guides, for a few weeks to get us ready for the summer. Experts lectured and we read so that we could create our own tours and have our own knowledge to share with visitors. I wore a period costume, but I also some days wore a Park Service uniform. The professionalism of the Park Service staff was clear. They had built a wonderful federal park from the foundations of an earlier state-run version. I became a lifelong fan of the Park Service as a result, and more committed than ever to complete my PhD and eventually become, against all the odds, a professor. George Washington, Valley Forge, and the Park Service have been with me ever since. And now, we will soon celebrate the sesquicentennial of the American Revolution, and I find myself here with George Washington and the Park Service again. Now, let me tell you something about stepfamilies. The subject of my third book, it seems there were a few in this area, especially in the Washington family. The only portrait of the first family, titled The Washington Family, appears to depict a first marriage family with children, and yet the Washington family was another kind of traditional American family, a stepfamily. Edward Savage painted a large canvas of the domestic scene between 1789 and 1796. Washington displayed a print of the image in his dining room at Mount Vernon. Numerous companies made copies of this popular painting for sale. The children are actually George Washington's step-grandchildren, George Washington Parke Custis, or Wash, and Eleanor Parke Custis, Nellie. Washington sits relaxed with his arms resting on his step-grandson's shoulder. His step-granddaughter stands by her grandmother near Washington's enslaved man-servant valet, William Lee, or Billy. Reflecting a paternalistic view of many slave owners, Washington might have counted Lee as part of his family. Washington proudly sits in his military uniform looking over the plans of the new city of Washington, later D.C., while a view of the Potomac River serves as a backdrop. He is this quintessential slave master, plantation owner, military leader, husband, and step-grandfather. In other words, he appears as a patriarch of a family he has not sired. The first family was a stepfather family. Stepfamilies are a function of a certain kind of family in this period, a Northwestern European patterned family. The rigidity of the nuclear family and the reality of spouse loss for many in early America predicted problems. The people that often had more successful approaches to spouse loss, some indigenous and African or African-descended peoples, mitigated the impact of death on a surviving spouse and children through a matrilineal structure or female-descended family, polygamy, or a man married to multiple women, or extended families, multiple generations in one household. All these structures provided support for a grieving family that nuclear households in Northwestern European families failed to provide. Likewise, the poor of all ethnicities in North America and Europe had differing experiences. Households in these communities sometimes formed to facilitate financial survival as much as familial preference. Strangers and family members shared residence out of economic strategy and necessity. The story told here is about a subsection of people with financial means. Despite their minority status, however, the stepfamilies formed by them dominated cultural production in the past and still do today. Migration to North America began for Europeans in earnest in the 17th century. The English dominated in many areas later to become the United States. This is a patriarchal view of a stepfamily in England from about 1630. About the same time, the Puritans began arriving en masse at Mass Bay Colony. The man in the center of the action is Sir Richard Saltonstall. In the bed is his dead wife, Elizabeth Bassey Saltonstall. In the chair is his very much alive at the time wife, Mary Parker Saltonstall. Both part of the patriarch-centered Saltonstall family. The children all have the same father, if not the same mother. The children from Saltonstall's first marriage are on his right, Richard and Anne. The child on his left, in the lap of his new wife, was either John, who was born in 1634, but then died very young, or Philip, who was born in 1636. Sir Richard extends a glove and gloved hand in the direction of his dead wife, versus his bare hand, which reaches out to hold the hand of his daughter. He's generous and surrounded by offspring. This was the Saltonstall family. I wonder what the women dead and alive thought of this perspective. Let me jump now to the female world of stepfamilies. It's 1697. Charles Perrault publishes The Tales of Mother Goose, including the adult tale of Cinderella. Cinderella at that time was a news story originally designed to entertain adults in the French court. This image is an example of the same story from the early 19th century. By that time, Cinderella had morphed into a story for children, as it is today. So you have Cinderella in her carriage, and she's dancing. Similarly, in the early 1800s, although the story of Cinderella was not in their collection, the Brothers Grimm published revised versions of old folk tales that included evil stepmothers like Cinderella's. The stories we know today, such as Hansel and Gretel and Snow White, the Grimms changed from earlier renderings of evil mothers doing horrible things to their children to the more marketable evil stepmothers causing their stepchildren harm. In my mind, the 18th century, bracketed by the birth of Cinderella on the one hand and the wildly successful collection of stories by Brothers Grimm on the other, is key to understanding what happened culturally to stepfamilies in Europe and North America. The ideas that developed during this time about stepfamilies still have resonance today. When I started working on this topic, I found that historians rarely studied stepfamilies or assumed these families in the past mimicked fairy tale stereotypes. This really surprised me. Why would historians think that fairy tales reflected facts? One reason for the easy acceptance of popular culture as reality was the difficulty of studying stepfamilies as a group. First, figuring out who was who in the records. If you've ever done your family history, you may know this. The historians use, this was really challenging. A step relation was often called an in-law. In other words, mother-in-law only. And you still called your in-laws in-laws. Rather than stepmother or stepfather, also in the case of step-siblings, the term brother and sister was used, rather than stepbrother or stepsister, and that also was sometimes used for in-laws. So it's a heck of a thing trying to figure it out. How could one distinguish one kind of family from another in early American records? Families had to be studied individually, I thought, to unravel these relationships. I was convinced that this type of family form was common. For example, focusing on the mostly Anglo-descended population of New England, where a great deal of demographic work has been done, historians estimate that about 40% of marriages were remarriages in the 18th and early 19th century. Remarriages, unlike first marriages, usually meant the creation of a stepfamily. Therefore, remarriage rates give us some rough sense of the prevalence of this family form. This is the Copley family. And John Singleton Copley is the artist, and he's standing in the back. And then in front of him is his father-in-law, his wife's father, and then his wife, surrounded by the children. The stereotype of stepfamilies and even the concept itself was linked to an 18th century change in family life, which this image represents. which is this idea of the sentimental family. This new form of family was connected to the rise of the middle class in Europe and North America. These ideal families were child-centered and mother-run, as you see clearly in this painting. Therefore, family structure versus the Saltonstall painting, pretty dramatic difference. Therefore, family structure was particularly important because it demarcated class status. In other words, without an intact nuclear family, one's class status was at risk. Spouse loss was a very serious problem for the class-conscious, middling sort of Anglo-Americans. Such a problem could only be solved through remarriage and the creation of a stepfamily. Stepfamilies were the solution to the problem of the basic fragility of nuclear families, basically creating a new, if cobbled together, nuclear family. For men, remarriage meant finding a companion for themselves, but often what they call a new mother for their children. With the rise of the sentimental family, there was pressure to provide a loving home led by a woman. And this became the stepmother. For women, remarriage meant avoiding the wrong man, which is still a good idea today. A man that might misuse his power over her estate and the inheritance of her children. When a woman married, she became a femme couvert, or covered woman, legally, and all her property became her new spouse's when she married. An inheritance she received from a previous husband, or a legacy he tried to keep intact for her minor children, were at risk if she remarried. Widowed women, if they had the means, could choose to stay single, given the risk involved in remarrying. Some did. One woman trying to mitigate these risks was Mary Fish. As you can see here, Mary Fish married a man named Noyes, Silliman, and Dickinson. So she married 3 times. But she really debated getting married at all the second time. One woman trying to mitigate it was Mary Fish. She was born in Stonington, Connecticut in 1736. She was the daughter of Reverend Joseph Fish and Rebecca Peabody Fish. Joseph Fish was a minister in North Stonington, Connecticut from 1731 to 1781 and ran a, quote, Indian school there. And Mary's mother was descended from some of the first families of New England. Mary married her first husband, John Noyes, in 1759. The young couple lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and with her in-laws, which was an unusual arrangement, but he wasn't well. John Noyes, he was a graduate of Yale and taught for a time, but wasn't able to lead a church, which was the goal of most Yale graduates in the 18th century, because he was not in good health. He probably had tuberculosis. He died of consumption, as they called it then, and fits, which would be seizures, in 1767. Mary Fish Noyes became a widow at the age of 31. She was also the mother of 4 children. She remained unmarried for 8 years, renting rooms in her former in-law's house. That was a very common thing for widows to do in New Haven, and raising her children. When contemplating remarriage, she made sure that her intended, and it's the weirdest name ever, his first name is Gold, as in the metal, gold, Selleck Silliman, understood her predicament. She described her ideal mate in a letter to Silliman. May he indeed be a father to my fatherless children, ever anxious to promote their good on every account. May he look on the inheritance of their father as sacred, never to be converted to the augmenting of his own estate. Let him put it under the best advantage to be profitable, as well for their future advantage as present education. So she made her expectations very clear before they married. Stepfathers actually had much more potential to be evil than the often maligned evil stepmother of popular culture because of their legal strength. The judge in one Connecticut court case saw limiting the remarriage of widows in a will. So you could leave a widow some property and then say only if she doesn't remarry. And that was done rarely. As an appropriate way, he said, to encourage widows with children to remain single. It would seem very reasonable that a man leaving a widow with 7 children, as in this present case, should be permitted to encourage her by suitable provision in his will to remain single and not subject his own offspring to the probable evils of a stepfather. Stepfathers were the men that both a remarrying widow and a dying married man with children most feared. Those fears were very often outlined in property law as well as in the will. One example of a man that took advantage of the law to absorb his stepchildren's patrimony was a revolutionary leader, Silas Deane. Deane was born in Ledyard, Connecticut in 1737, the son and grandson of a blacksmith, middling sort. His family had done well enough to provide their eldest son with a college education when Silas graduated from Yale in 1758. After a short stint as a teacher, he became a lawyer, which was another option for educated men. He moved to Wethersfield, Connecticut, to set up his practice. There he had the good fortune to meet and marry Mehetable Knott Webb, a wealthy and newly widowed woman with 6 children. They had first met when she asked him as a lawyer to help him settle her dead husband's estate. After their marriage, Silas took over the mercantile business of his predecessor, ultimately leaving his own career in the law behind to focus on the West Indian trade, as it was called then. He had 1 child with Mehetable, born 8 months after their wedding. 2 years after Mehetable died, in 1769, he married again, this time into the prestigious, politically well-connected Saltonstall family. He's climbing, you see. His second wife, Elizabeth Saltonstall Evarts, was the granddaughter of the former governor of the colony. Elizabeth died in 1777. They had no children. During his time with Elizabeth, Deane became a politician and diplomat, representing Connecticut in the Continental Congress. He was also chosen to negotiate with the French at the start of the American Revolution in secret. Deane's political career was marred, however, by an accusation that he had used his diplomatic position to his own economic advantage. He died in 1789 at the age of 52, still working to clear his name. Deane, using an elaborate scheme of real estate acquisitions, transferred the Webb orphans' property into his own hands. He let his wife keep the deeds to the properties to try to soothe her concerns about her children's inheritance from their father. In the end, Mehetable found herself on her deathbed clutching these papers, according to the court testimony of her children. Very ill, and with her eldest son, Joseph, away on a trip to New York, she called her 11-year-old daughter, Sarah, nicknamed Sally, to her side. Although Sally was, quote, then very young and inexperienced, end quote, her mother had no choice but to turn to her for assistance. She gave Sally the deeds and other papers, quote, enjoining her in the most strict and solemn manner to keep them safe and secure and not to deliver them to any person whatsoever except to Joseph. Unfortunately, Mehetable died before her son's return. The court testimony continues. And when a corpse in the house, the said Silas applied to the said Sarah, that's Sally, to know if any papers had been left with her by the said Mehetable the elder. And the said Sarah, placing the utmost confidence in the said Silas, whom she considered her father and protector, was prevailed upon by said Silas to deliver to him the said deeds and papers. This was the first version of the testimony. A second version followed that made Dean look even more despicable. In this revised version, Silas, quote, insisted that she, Sally, should deliver them, as the deeds and papers, to him, assigning as a reason they might contain directions for her mother's funeral, which could not otherwise be attended. Yeah, he's really not, you're gonna like him by the end of this. Once Silas procured the deeds, they never left his hand again. He kept them secreted and out of view. His purpose was clear from the perspective of the Webb kids. He had the intention, quote, to deprive said heirs unjustly of said lands and reserve them to his own benefit. He also received into his hands about 40,000 pounds, quote, a great part of which has never been accounted for by Silas Dean. The court documents demonstrate more than anger at an unscrupulous stepfather. However, they reveal the betrayal felt by the Webb children at Dean's mishandling of their dead father's estate. He had been Sally's father and protector. He betrayed her trust and the trust of her siblings, absconding with their money. The Webb children joined a list of creditors clamoring to squeeze blood from a stone after Dean's death. The estate was finally settled in 1802, 13 years later. The Webbs received justice in court, and they were the victors, but they received little in the way of property. What the Webb children did get from the court, at least, was official acknowledgement that their stepfather had misused their trust. This Revolutionary War leader eventually took his place, at least officially, among those who had made the conflict a success. He was never exonerated, however, for his treatment of the Webb children. Now, not all stepfathers are evil. An example of a different kind of stepfather was Edward Holyoke. Elizabeth and Samuel Epps came to live with the Holyoke children in 1740, and their mother became the third wife of Edward Holyoke, a longtime president of Harvard University. Sammy was 6 and Elizabeth only 4. They were surrounded by 8 stepsisters and stepbrothers, ranging in age from 1 to 14. 2 years later, with the birth of Mary Holyoke, the half-sister of all the children of the household, the brood expanded again. When Elizabeth Epps died in 1759, she had already lost 2 stepbrothers, 1 stepsister, and her half-sister Mary. She still had her full-blood brother Samuel, her eldest stepbrother Edward Augustus, and 4 stepsisters, Margaret, Elizabeth, Anna, and Priscilla. They were all given the name brother and sister in her will. On her deathbed, Elizabeth worried the most about the welfare of her mother, but also she was concerned about her step-siblings. Elizabeth left her well-beloved, full-blood brother a small legacy of a suit of mourning clothing to wear at her funeral. She noted, quote, I trust my brother will not be offended when I assure him that what I have done was not owing to any disaffection to him, end quote, but rather a concern for others and her feeling of gratitude to her stepfather. Elizabeth Epps bequeathed most of her estate to her mother, not just for her own sake, but to, quote, keep that means his being her stepfather's family together. To keep his stepfamily together, and in some measure return to them the many kindnesses they have received from their father. Elizabeth explained that her stepfather had been the best of fathers to me, but she knew that his benevolent heart, I love this, I am sensible, never permit him to lay up much treasure on earth. In other words, he got money and he gave it away. So, as a result, if her mother became widowed, she would, quote, not be able to do that for his children, which I am sure she would be inclined to do. Elizabeth hoped to provide for her step-siblings by leaving the resources she had inherited from her own father, Simon Epps, to her mother, and through her to her step-siblings. Similarly, when her brother Samuel died 16 months later, he also provided for his step-siblings after his mother's death. After settling his business affairs and debts, he turned to the needs of his family. He left a significant portion of his estate specifically to his two youngest stepsisters and his stepbrother. Quote, "I give to my beloved brother Edward Augustus Holyoke, Anna Holyoke, Priscilla Holyoke, equally to be divided between them." End quote. What remained of his mother's legacy after her death? Edward Augustus was Samuel's oldest and only surviving stepbrother. Samuel appointed Edward the executor of his will and charged him with caring for his mother, Edward's stepmother. Edward took on both responsibilities, settling Samuel's estate and watching over his stepmother's portion until her death 30 years later. The Epps family fortune nurtured the roots of the Holyoke family tree in this good stepfather family. As for the wicked stepmother, popular culture warned one and all that stepmothers were a problem. But how these women were represented as troublesome shifted in tandem with new representations of motherhood in the 18th century. Stories about cruel stepmothers were not new in the 18th century. Such stereotypes can be traced in Western tradition back to ancient times. The English language itself reflected the conflation of evil women and stepmothers. The most negative of the terms for a stepmother was a stepdame, and originally referred to all wicked mothers. For example, in an anonymous publication from 1637, stepdames were identified as, quote, unnatural mothers. But significantly, not all the stepdames in this collection of stories were actually stepmothers. The author of Nature's Cruel Stepdames, or Matchless Monsters of the Female Sex, included two gruesome tales of murdering mothers. The widow Elizabeth Barnes, for example, stabbed her own 8-year-old daughter to death. The hapless child was, quote, the fruit of her own womb. The other so-called stepdame, but actually a mother, was Anne Willis, who, giving birth to a bastard child, threw her live newborn down a vault in Rosemary Lane, which is probably a privy, where it was found dead. Neither of these women were stepmothers. Rather, the name of stepdame captured their unnatural, murderous behavior. These kinds of stories remained common, but a new version of stepmother wickedness appeared alongside and combined with these earlier stories as the 18th century progressed. Characterizations of stepmothers as poor substitute mothers joined descriptions of more familiar ideas about stepmother cruelty, because the mothers of new middling level families were natural mothers of the Enlightenment, both loving and child-centered. The behavior of bad mothers found no purchase in this new ideology. Maternal paragons could not be, by definition, cruel or wicked. Stepmothers are the perfect solution to this cultural dilemma. The negative aspects of motherhood were simply bequeathed to stepmothers. By the end of the 18th century, etymology of the word stepmother suggests that stepmothers were not just evil women, but also inferior replacements for mothers. Samuel Johnson, in a dictionary of the English language, the first standardized English dictionary, noted that for the Saxons, the word step was used only in reference to stepmother, a stepdaughter, or a stepson. Notice there's no stepfather in there. Although all these variations, according to Johnson, had been common in his own time, the prefix step was, quote, now seldom applied but to the mother. Johnson also indirectly revealed the term step when used to refer to a stepmother had taken on an added meaning. He remarked, I like this, it seems to mean in the mind of those who use it, a woman who has stepped into the vacant place of the true mother. By the early 19th century in the United States, the word stepdame had become synonymous with stepmother and used only in that context. Noah Webster published the first dictionary of American English, a compendious dictionary of the English language, which included an entry for stepchild and stepfather, but instead of stepmother, Webster substituted the word stepdame. To Webster's mind, all stepmothers were stepdames. What did stepmother cruelty look like? In an anonymous story from an 1825 edition of the Providence Gazette titled The Stepmother, the author outlines the emotional chaos that inevitably followed remarriage and the installation of a stepmother. How momentous a thing it is to introduce a wife who is not the parent of her husband's family into it. What jealousy, what injustice, what strife does not occur from such a union? How many struggles to alienate prior affection, what pouting and striving. The author suggested that, quote, a man and woman ought to think thrice before they give a nominal mother to motherless children. The slighted, as he called them, stepchildren, ignored as the unwelcome remains of a previous marriage, inevitably ran, quote, headlong to ruin and despair, take to idle habits and a vicious life, imbibe at an early age the poison of envy and hatred, end quote. Children, unfortunate enough to have a stepmother, naturally, quote, pine in the wasting agonies of sensibility wounded by neglect, end quote. They suffered the tyranny of a strange woman placed in usurped authority over them. The author concluded that all stepmothers deserve the title injusticia noverca, an unjust stepmother. Quote, it depends on her alone to merit a better name, end quote. When one curious man asked another at the conclusion of this diatribe, quote, what is a stepmother? His friend, surprised, responded that, of course, a, quote, stepmother is a step toward being a mother and yet no mother at all, at all. How did this kind of prejudice play out in stepmother families? I present to you the family of Theodore Sedgwick and his second wife. This is not a picture of her. Unfortunately, there is no picture of her. That's his daughter, Catherine Maria Sedgwick, very famous author. And his second wife was named Penelope Russell. His daughter, Catherine Maria, wrote a memoir at the age of 60, concluding that her experience as a stepchild had followed a predictable storyline. After the death of her mother, quote, my father felt his solitarity of his home. He was the sort of man to whom the companionship of a woman is a necessity, end quote. Her father failed to follow the imperative to find a suitable new mother for his children, and the predictable turmoil resulted in her mind. Necessity moved him to marry, quote, again a little more than a year after my mother's death, end quote. His choice was a spinster, Penelope Russell, quote, a Boston woman of a highly respectable family, an agreeable exterior, and attractive vivacity. The speed of remarriage and his choice of partner answered his needs, but not necessarily those of his family. Looking back, Catherine Maria felt some pity for her stepmother, but as a child, she clearly mocked the new Mrs. Sedgwick's efforts to take her mother's place. Quote, the poor lady was put in a life for which she was totally unfitted. She knew nothing of the business of country domestic life. They lived in rural Massachusetts. Quote, and her ambition to shine in it was simply ludicrous to us, onerous to us. She fluttered gracefully enough through the inanities of town drawing rooms, but the realities and simplicity of our country life was insupportable to her, end quote. In addition, as the elderly Catherine Maria put it predictably, quote, like most second marriages where there are children, it was disastrous. There were happy stepmother families, despite the expectations of popular culture. Mather Byles married 3 times in the end. and had a contented mixed family by all accounts. Still, the family was aware of the cultural expectations that burdened a stepmother family. This was a loyalist family. They went from New London, Connecticut to Boston and eventually to Nova Scotia. Mather Byles lost his beloved wife, Rebecca Walter Byles, in 1775, the same year that events at Lexington and Concord shook the foundations of British North America, the city of Boston, and Reverend Byles's congregation. As a royalist, as they called themselves then, leading an increasingly independence-minded congregation, Byles realized his need for a new position. He, like other loyalists, left Boston on the heels of the British. By May of 1776, he wrote his Anglican superiors in England, not from Boston, but from English Nova Scotia. He described the days leading up to his departure in part through the lens of his personal family crisis, his loss of a partner, and his children's loss of a mother. He had prepared himself for, quote, close confinement, scarcity of provision, and even cannonading and bombardment. But I must confess, I had not the least suspicion that the army would ever have evacuated Boston, that is the British Army. Caught up in the resulting chaos, he found himself unable to, quote, bring away my furniture or anything I possessed, but a couple of beds or such articles as might be contained in a few trunks and boxes, end quote. Within a few days, he found himself in Halifax, a city overrun with other Loyalist refugees. His situation was dire, quote, pent up in one wretched chamber in a strange place together with my 5 motherless children, 1 son and 4 daughters, the ages 5 to 13. Luckily for Byles, he was awarded the position of chaplain for the British garrison in Halifax. He also thankfully found a partner to mend his broken family. Sarah Lyde, also a Boston refugee, became his wife by midsummer 1777. 10 years later, in 1787, the same year the American Constitution dictated the contours of the nation, Mather Byles found himself a widower again. He again looked to repair his family, this time with children from both his first and second marriages in tow. His eldest was 27 and the youngest was 9. When he married in 1789, the childless widow Susanna Lawler Reed, his 2 youngest children had a stepmother for the first time and his 5 oldest children for the second time. From all accounts, Sarah Lyde Byles was a new mother to these children. Less than a year after Mather's second marriage, a family friend informed Byles' sister in Boston that, quote, your brother and sweet family are well. It would charm you to see the sweet olive branches around their mother, and indeed even must say she does the duty of a parent by them. This, I know, will make you happy in hearing. This is a good example of the word mother being used and not knowing who the heck this is, and figuring out the connections. Mather Byles wrote to his sisters, my wife is a most excellent woman and delights in diffusing happiness all around her. She is dear to me and beloved by my family, which exhibits the curious spectacle of 2 sets of children and a third wife, all living together in the most perfect harmony and love, without one jarring string or the least mixture of coolness or jealousy, end quote. Stepmothers were both good and bad, as were stepfathers. The difference being that popular culture expected stepmothers to be bad. This mattered more over time as sentimental, female-run families became linked to class status. The potential power of stepfathers did worry men on their deathbeds, as reflected in their carefully crafted wills. The law itself predicted problems. Only a woman's continued widowhood or a shrewd marital choice would guarantee her and her children's safety. George Washington was born into a stepfamily. His mother, Mary Bell, was stepmother as soon as she married the widower Augustine Washington. Ball herself had been born into a stepfamily. Augustine Washington lived in a stepfather family. After Augustine's mother died, he may have lived with both a stepmother and stepfather for a stretch. George Washington also found himself as a married man in the role of stepfather, and later, after losing both stepchildren, he helped care for his step-grandchildren. I've moved on from Valley Forge. I am now working on a project about Barbados, but as some of you may know, there's a George Washington house there as well. In the fall of 17, and now I understand from Melissa this may not be true, but that this is the right house, but I visited it when I was there. In the fall of 1751, a young George Washington went with his sick half-brother Lawrence in search of a climate that might help ease Lawrence's tuberculosis symptoms. These half-brothers, like those described here, found common cause more than conflict. When Lawrence died soon after, George took up a position in the Virginia militia, following Lawrence's lead, and he also eventually inherited Lawrence's plantation, Mount Vernon. Even and in fact especially in the early years of English settlement in North America, Anglo-American families were complex and layered. Today, 42% of people say they have step relations. They still struggle with stereotypes refined in the 18th century. These are not broken families, as some have said, they are normal families. I would argue that not only were step families prevalent in the past, they were and are traditional American families. Popular culture has to catch up to this reality. It seems appropriate to end with the premier mythmaker, Walt Disney. This image from 1950 is a mid-century modern Cinderella and her evil stepmother. Disney remade the classic in 2015. The stepmother is still cruel, if no longer a cartoon. Recently released in March, there was a new Snow White from Disney. There was a lot of controversy about this film based on the representation of other characters, but there was no public debate about the profoundly evil, in this case murderous, stepmother. I'm sure there have been and will be more versions of these tales. The evil stepmother lives on. Thank you.